Okay, so this is our Residency 4 simulation presentation where we go over our simulation results and a few of the approaches that we had. Okay, let me go into it. So in terms of recapping, we did 4 simulation runs in total, but we felt that our first 2 were pretty stark difference. They had very big differences in terms of our emissions. You can see here we didn't reach the 50% goal, but the difference between 46% and 42% while being able to stay within the carbon budget on our first run and I guess the viewpoints that we had going into each run. Our first run, we kind of wanted to cut down on emissions and keep our consumption low, but we didn't want to spend a lot in at the very beginning. And you'll be able to see a little bit further into our game summary once we get into it on this side. But in terms of going over a recap of our results, energy consumption and production development over time. So if we go, this is our first run. You can kind of see our electricity consumption went down pretty substantially. We were able to cut it down from 7.1 to 4.5, and we did not invest into anything renewable. And in our second simulation, we did. So here you can see that we produced 200,000 from our solar panels, which we bought in our first year. So that was kind of the initial thought with this run was make it so that our consumption was as low as possible. And you can kind of see that, we didn't do as good of a job this year. Well, we did, I guess, in terms of electricity, but overall our emissions didn't weren't weren't where we wanted them to be. And in our first year, we were surprised to see that, even though we weren't investing as much into electricity, it wasn't there was a huge difference in carbon emissions, and you can kind of see that here. If you go to emissions, you can see this first run here. Electricity was by and large the largest emission that we had, and I think we go into a little bit further here, but yeah, just the percentages you can see those here. First simulation again, and some second simulation here. The percentage of total carbon budget. So we just were able to stay right under that carbon budget. Our first run where we kind of focused on keeping our financials high, and you can kind of see that here. Probably some investment right here, and then we ended up with $6.3 million in operating profit, and then we only ended up with $5.7 million per year as our highest in our second simulation, where we kind of focused on emissions a little bit more. So you can kind of see that here, like for this last question, revenue in both, I believe, they kind of stayed similar, and our operating profit looks very, very similar as well, except one is significantly higher than the other. Revenue looks to be roughly the same. Yeah, kind of in that $40 million range total revenue. And here it's pretty much the same as well. So going into our runs here, you can see just to make this a little larger, to do an analysis, you can see, like I said, electricity was by and large our largest source of energy consumption. And you can in our second run, I believe, this electricity consumption it was from, let me go into it. You can kind of see here from our game summary. You can see very early on we did rooftop solar installation, LED lighting, and we recruited a sustainability manager. But you can see we did a lot here in terms of upgrading our AC, and then I believe some of it wasn't as substantial, but yeah. So our electricity was by far the largest source of our emissions, and we'll get into a little bit of reflection here towards the end, but let me move on to Aaron's part of the presentation.
So some of the types of consumptions and sources of emission that were easy to reduce were water and food. We didn't really put that much effort into reducing those. In food, we did take three initiatives for food. Two of them were in the seventh year, so that didn't have minimal effect on reducing the food. But yeah, when we did our food waste composition, reducing that helped a lot to reduce the amount of food that we were wasting and our waste. The importance of water, waste, and food relative to electricity, not very important in terms of reducing the amount of electricity that we were using. Food, when we upgraded or changed some of our equipment in the kitchen, that helped out with reducing electricity, not in the first year that we did it, but in the latter years after. And by scope, well, the scope one we didn't really see that much of a increase or decrease, a slight decrease after year one for scope one, which is the emissions resulting of on-site activity. In scope two and three, we kind of saw similar decreases. Scope two started at 1,636 CO2 tons and reduced down to 803 tons. And likewise, scope three started at 1,344 tons, and we saw a slight increase the first year, which is probably from upgrading the air conditioning systems. And then we saw that reduce down to 909 CO2 tons. Um, so that answers the scope three. There was an increase in our scope three um, from the first year, which was yeah. You can go to the next one. Thank you. And then analyzing the impact of decisions taken on each of the areas. Energy was probably some of the more costly initiatives, and some of the ones that had the biggest impact was from energy management. We did do going paperless and recycling bins in the rooms, which are just small changes, didn't really have that much of effect on our energy usage. Purchasing. Installing the water efficient appliances definitely helped out reducing our water consumption. The purchase of low carbon furniture was also probably the bigger ones, along with the laundry that had an impact from the purchasing section. Um, Eliminating plastic bottles also helped. Going paperless for management was one that was not very costly, but did help reduce some of our waste that we were producing. Some high impact categories for energy, I'd say were probably our solar installation and upgrading the air conditionings. Those are two initiatives that were costly and didn't do much at the beginning, but in the later years definitely helped us out. Medium ones would be replacing the restaurant equipment, while that did help. And revolving doors, I'd say, is medium impact, as well as the smart climate control. For purchasing, outsourcing our laundry was definitely something that had a high impact, while reducing our cost up front of staff members. And installing water efficient faucets was also something that I believe was high impact. Something that would be medium impact would be the low carbon carpets. For management, I think food waste composting had a high impact on while reducing our food levels. But other than that, I think that was one that was an initiative that was relatively pretty cheap for us. And medium impacts would be going paperless and adjusting the temperature in the lobby. While adjusting the temperature in the lobby was free. That helped us out with reducing our CO2 emissions. And going paperless was also relatively pretty cheap. And I believe for the cost, it was worth investing into.
Okay, and just to go into a few analysis points here at the end. So, in terms of staff training and guest communication, we were pretty all over the place in terms of that. You can see in our first run here. Let me see, that was in here somewhere. So, training and communication. You can see that we spent kind of a little bit more towards the beginning and then a little bit less towards the end. And I think this would be something that would require a lot more runs to kind of be able to see a real difference because when we did do a little bit more training in this first run, there was a decision that we made that involved, you can see here, I think it was in year 4, Um, let's see, the sustainability rating. So on this first run, when it was spending more, we didn't see an impact on that. And then like, in the notes that it gives you, there wasn't anything negative about that. But then in this second summary or the second instance, we spent significantly less on training and communication. You can see it was pretty consistently like 100 and then 150 and 130 towards the end, whereas we implemented this in year four, and then in that time frame we were spending significantly more, 220, 190, 170. So I think if you wanted to be a little bit more strategic about it, you could have probably spent more per year when you knew you were going to do something that might have been a little bit negative in terms of viewpoints from your consumers and from your employees. So that could have been something that we could have changed in retrospect. Sustainability officers, like I said, at first when we implemented that rating, um, with that sustainability officer, it was significantly cheaper than the other option that was there. We didn't purchase that second option because we had that sustainability officer, but I think it was something like a difference of 50,000 per year versus 25,000 per year. It wasn't exactly one to one. I think it was like a sustainability report that went out every year and then a rating. But even then, it's like, well, depending on your viewpoint, I suppose, and how the formatting and the coding for this works, it might be worth it to have the sustainability manager. But that's, like I said, something that probably would take a lot more simulation runs, maybe, 10, 15, depending on how you do it, to see if they really have a big impact. Um, so the impact of sustainability initiatives on financial performance, cost, and revenue. Obviously, at first, you'll see big dips like this when you make big investments. Things like your LED lighting, upgrading air conditioning is a really big thing. The smart climate control, not as much, but replacing restaurant and kitchen equipment. All these are a lot bigger in terms of the impact that it has on your revenue, and you can kind of see that here, like in this game summary. Off the rip, we decided to do solar installation and LED lighting. In second year, we decided to do air conditioning. So it's like all of that was pretty substantial in terms of uh dipping our operation profit, and you can kind of see that here, like 5.2, 5.3, and then you can see a big dip here to 4.8. And it's kind of, it just makes sense. The earlier you do this kind of thing, you're going to see an increase in costs just from the installation and potential operating costs, but you do see that things like emissions kind of come down significantly. And although we weren't able to reach this target, it's significantly different here, where you can see that by the end of this we were emitting 2.4, and this year we were doing 1.8. So it's like the percentage of that alone is significant, but um, I don't know if this is something that's based off of what your first year investments are, your baseline, or if it's just random every single year. But um, you can kind of see that that impact of sustainability initiatives in real time. And then in terms of critical takeaways from the simulation game, I think it was really insightful in terms of seeing that, for the most part, depending on how long you're seeing things, I suppose if you want to be a little bit more long-term oriented or short-term oriented, making significant investments like the solar panels or the upgrading of the AC systems is something that, if you're a business that really cares about year to year, quarter to quarter profitability, and you don't care as much about emissions, it's probably not something you're gonna do unless you absolutely have to, especially like something like your AC. Like if it just gets busted or if it's on the verge of being busted, you might want to go in and replace that out of necessity. But if you're a company that's a little bit more proactive, you can definitely do something like that in the short term if you have that uh, money that you want to spend that's a little bit more expendable in the beginning. But it, I guess it's just like the approach here you can see is just like, even though you do make those big purchases very early on, um, your financials could be significantly lower than a company that doesn't do that, but your emission target and your emission uh, your emissions in general could be more. And I think it's just kind of like, you kind of have to pick and choose as a company whether or not that's something that you want to care for. And in this second year, when we were caring a lot about our emissions and investing a lot into our emissions, we actually went over on our budget, whereas in our first year or our first simulation where we didn't really care much about emissions as much and cared a little bit more about profit, we're just under that. So it's kind of just like you have to decide what you want to do and what you want to care about. But again, the simulation, I don't know if it's random. I don't know what the baseline is based off of. It's probably something that, like I said, we're gonna have to we have to do more digging into and a little bit take a little bit more time with it. But for the sake of this presentation, it's not something that we did or we'll probably end up doing. But it was valuable in terms of thinking about what are we going to do in terms of cutting down our emissions and maintaining profitability because it's ultimately as a business you want your purpose is to make a profit, but you also do have to care about things like this, like emissions and long-term energy consumption, because it's not only something that you gain from a socio a social perspective and an environmental perspective. You can do something if you're investing into that sort of thing. You can also make yourself more profitable by not using as much energy. But yeah, I think that pretty much summarizes our presentation. And thank you for taking the time to listen to us. Thank you.